Anthony
Pro
Blinken
et
said
contra.
that Ukraine will become a member of NATO.
Yeah. Well, I've come up with a crude analogy or metaphor for it. Yeah, Ukraine joining NATO will be like a guy with no arms and no legs joining a track club, a track and field club that they go out and they run marathons every weekend. How's that guy going to fit in? He's not. Maybe he gets a motorized wheelchair. Yeah, I can, putter along behind him. Point is, doesn't bring anything to the activity. He's just an additional burden. Bringing NATO, Ukraine into NATO 3 years ago, oh yeah, that made sense from the standpoint of Ukraine had a 700,000 man army, large army. They had pretty advanced weaponry with some tanks and fixed wing aircraft and helicopters. And well, they were kitted out, ready to go. And they had trained troops. These troops had conducted regular military exercises with the United States and the United Kingdom and other NATO countries for, I guess, going back to like 2008, that far. So 16 years, or let's say 14 years at the start of the special military operation. That's significant. But now, they're the original cadre of trained officers and enlisted personnel. They're dead, wounded. They don't have any tanks. They don't have any artillery pieces that are their own. They don't have any factories to make it. They're out of ammunition. They're out of artillery shells. They're having to scrape, borrow, beg that from the United States now, and the United States barely has enough to last, 2 or 3 days. So, they bring nothing to the table. And yet this is Anthony Blinken's great initiative. Oh, yeah, now that Russia's beaten the hell out of them, we're going to let them into NATO. And, the Russians are doing what the Russians have to do in terms of, as Putin laid out at the outset, demilitarize, denazify. And they are going to continue doing that. And I think when the collapse comes, and I think it will be a collapse, it's not going to be a gradual surrender. It'll go cave in, sort of like that Francis Scott Key Bridge did when he got struck by the ship in Baltimore Harbor. It'll be ugly. It'll be quick, and then NATO's got to figure out where it goes next.
Do you think everything is under control for the United States, or are we gonna have something like a military coup in Ukraine?
I think the odds are high for a military coup, particularly as the situation grows worse. The efforts to try to negotiate a deal are falling. I know the other day that Shoigu, who comes from what is it, Tula? He comes from what's considered one of the roughest, most crime-ridden republics in Russia, and yet, despite coming from low, he wasn't rich, wasn't part of a wealthy family. He's been able to climb the ladder, so he's the defense minister. And he talked to a French counterpart. The French guy was, "Hey, please, can we go back and restart what we were doing in Turkey?" And Shoigu basically said, "No, that's ancient history. We'll talk to you guys now, but this, you can start off by stop supplying weapons and personnel to Ukraine." And the outshot of that call was Francois Macron came out and blasted them for everything that they could. Accused the Russians. It's not going anywhere. So Russia's going to negotiate on its terms, and the West, I don't think the West yet is willing to make any kind of concessions like they need to.
Michael McCall, a member of the U.S. House of Representatives,
Yeah.
He said he was quoting Jake Sullivan, that he says that Jake Sullivan was saying that Russia will launch a nuclear first strike against the US if military aid to Ukraine is excessive. Do you think really Jake Sullivan is thinking this way?
Yeah, he sounds like he had a visit with Zelensky and got into some of Zelensky's cocaine, so affected his judgment. No, Russia's not going to use nukes unless they face what they perceive as a genuine nuclear threat. If the United States deploys F-16s into Poland and Russia, at that point, Russia's first move will be to destroy them with conventional arms, because they do represent a potential nuclear threat. Ditto for the Taurus missile in Germany. If that gets forward deployed, then Russia recognizes it has the potential to be used as a nuclear strike.
It seems that Duda was asking the leaders of NATO countries to increase their spending on defense from 2 to 3% of their GDP. What's the plan here on the part of Poland? They were talking about sending troops to Ukraine as well.
Well, they've already sent troops. I mean, they've the largest number of mercenaries fighting on behalf of Ukraine are Poles. This irrational hatred of Russia. That's it. They're, the Poles, as you know, are largely Roman Catholic, and they are, loggerheads at odds with the Russia's Eastern Orthodox Christianity, for starters. So there's one divide. Then they got the history of Polish relations with the former Soviet Union. But they're, they ordered conscription, I believe, the other day. I was talking to Anya K, and she indicated that they had just ordered up some, greater mobilization of soldiers there in Poland. Then on top of that, you've got Germany today talking about they're going to have to move towards full mobilization because people aren't signing up for it. And so all that's going to create political chaos in those societies because, the 18, 19, 20-year-olds don't want to get called up for that. Russia ran into that a little bit, but has since recovered because they've had, several thousand Russian new recruits sign up since the bombing of that city hall 2 weeks ago.
It seems that Speaker Johnson is in some sort of agreement with the Biden administration to send $61 billion to Ukraine. How much of this fund that they're going to send to Ukraine going to get back to the military industrial complex? How much of this going to go to the pocket of Zelensky and his people? And how much of this going to be used in the battlefield?
Well, I think the vast majority, 80%, is going to go to U.S. military industrial corporations or contractors. I think maximum 20, maybe 10% will actually make its way into Ukraine. And when it does make its way into Ukraine, it's going to be, in the profit in the pockets of Zelensky and his crowd, some senior generals, some senior intel types.
Lavrov was talking about Bucha and what has happened during those days in Bucha. If you remember, they were blaming Russia, putting the blame on Russia about all of these people who have been killed in that region. Do you think mostly these people were killed by Russians or Ukrainians?
Oh, no, I think they were killed by Ukrainians and Brits. Yeah, that was a British PSYOPs operation. I think they were the masterminds behind that. Because at the time, the Russians they'd been out of the town 2 days before they discovered the bodies. It just, it was a very clumsy, covert action, but it was effective in convincing all the gullible people in the West that wanted to say, "Oh yeah, the Russians are terrible that way." I'm sure they did it, and they weren't telling the story at the time that one of the reasons they were pulling out was because of the peace talks that had taken place in Turkey. And as a gesture, a goodwill gesture, Putin had vowed that he would withdraw his forces from around Kiev, which is what they were doing.
Maria Zakharova was talking about that it seems that Ukrainians are trying to attack Zaporozhye nuclear power plant again. Are they getting to the point of desperation?
Well, I think they've been there for a while, candidly. And will they try to attack? The problem they face is that Russia has effective air defense and counter battery. So even though it's a big target, it's difficult to attack because the Russians are defending it. Yeah, will U.S. or British intelligence officers try to help facilitate that? Maybe. Can't rule it out. Or other foreign mercenaries, perhaps. But Russia's got a significant force there to defend against that. And the odds of them actually being able to breach it and cause significant damage is slim. But, if they damage it, it's damaging themselves. The Russians have already knocked out, I think, almost every major thermal power plant and hydroelectric power plant and coal-fired power plant along the Dnieper. But they waited until the worst of winter was over to do so, because I don't think they wanted to destroy the average Ukrainian citizen.
Kremlin spokesman Peskov, he was talking about that the risk of having a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia is increasing.
No, what you've seen is the increases come on the Russian side. They have stepped up their use of the glide bombs, the 1,500 kilogram, 3,000 kilogram. Those are huge bombs. They've stepped up the use, and as a result, they're destroying more Ukrainian defensive positions and killing more Ukrainian soldiers than ever before, killing them at a faster rate. Russia also has effective artillery, effective tanks. The other day they launched a 36 tank attack, and the West got all excited because the Ukrainians destroyed 12 of them. Russia makes over 1,200 tanks a month. So, yeah, they lost 12, but they're making it up by a huge factor. The United States can't even compete on that scale. So then, in addition to the glide bombs and the tanks, they built up their troop numbers all along that front, north to south, south to north, going from Kharkiv down to Kherson. And it's almost like whack-a-mole. The Russians will push on this side. Oh, the Ukrainians will run over there. Then they'll push on this side. And so the Ukrainians are spending so much time trying to figure out where the hell do they need to deploy their reserves. And the Russians sometimes can be pushing on 3 fronts at the same time. And then it really puts Ukraine in a bind. So, what you're looking at here is Ukraine at a great disadvantage. And even if they get, quote, a new package of weapons from the United States, who's going to use them? Who's trained to use them? Looks like nobody.
The Guardian reported that Ukrainian security services admit they organized terrorist attacks in Russia because Kiev's victory on the battlefield is impossible. With all of the information that came from these activities, these terrorist attacks, what's your take currently on this attack?
It angered the Russians, it united the Russian people, and they're hunting anybody down that's indirectly connected to it relentlessly. How is this a plus for Ukraine? It hasn't helped. It hasn't stopped one battle. It hasn't prevented one Russian soldier from advancing. It hasn't stopped tanks from being produced. Hasn't compelled Vladimir Putin to leave office. What did it accomplish other than killed a bunch of innocent people and really pissed off the Russians so that they're going after these guys with everything they have? And if it bleeds over into France or the United Kingdom or the United States, so be it. Putin's very, very clear. We're going to go after anybody who is indirectly connected to this, I'd hold them accountable, punish them.
The reports show that non-oil and gas revenues in Russia increased by 25% in 2023. And when you look at these type of reports, do you think are Europeans really understanding that what's going on in that region? Because they're losing a lot in that conflict.
Yeah, no, they don't understand. They live in a fantasy world because they're fed with a corporate media that's lying to them, repeatedly lying to them about what Russia's capabilities are and how Russia's doing. How do you deal with those kinds of lies? That's the issue. And so that's where alternative media, shows like yours and the Duran and Judge Napolitano, others that are out there, they try to get the word out, and they reach out, and they're able to make some contact with people and get some new information out there, and it starts growing. It is. You're too young to remember the samizdat period in the Soviet Union, but samizdat was while the Soviets went to great lengths to try to control the kind of information the average Russian could get, there were these informal people would like print off their own newspaper or handwrite a book, and they'd be passed around in copies hand to hand. It was this was pre-internet, and it was books like Dr. Zhivago were passed around and read. Reports on the real cause of the Chernobyl disaster passed around and read. So all that information had a way of getting out. And under samizdat back then, we're looking at that today with all these independent internet channels becoming a new form of samizdat.
We know that NATO was founded on April 4th, 1949. When they started this coalition, this type of alliance, they thought that it's going to be a defensive alliance. And
that's how they sold it, okay? That's how they sold it. So if you've got a beat up car that's like 60 years old and it's rusted out in the panels and the tires are bald, but you go out and say, hey, this is a classic. It's an antique. Got to have it. They were sold a bag of goods with NATO, because NATO was not a defensive. They always say, oh, we're defensive. Then why are you practicing amphibious landings in Ukraine? That's not defensive. That's offensive. Why were you teaching NATO? Why was NATO teaching at Yavoriv base in Ukraine cyber warfare, offensive cyber warfare? It was on their website. After the special military operation started, they took it down. Oh, we can't have that. So my point is, NATO was a scam from the outset, because Russia was ready. The Soviets then were even ready to continue working with the West. And, the West, the combination of Churchill trying to hang on to Britain's colonial empire that was crumbling around it, and the Soviets' desire to really have a buffer between them and Germany and France. Oh, why should they be worried about Germany and France? Well, because they had been invaded by both countries at least 2 times in the previous 100 years. So yeah, I want to have a fence up to keep those neighbors as far away as possible. And that's why they, took control of Poland and Romania and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, all the way on, going down to the Balkans. They wanted a buffer zone between them and the West. West interpret that as, see, these communists they're intent on global domination. They're going to conquer the world. Yeah, they played sort of tit for tat with the United States, because the United States was constantly involved with undercover regime changes in Iran, your own country, 1953, with Mossadegh, 1954, Jacobo Arbenz, Guatemala, Patrice Lumumba later down in in Zimbabwe. You know, boom, boom, boom. United States kept doing regime changes and not making the world better. So that's the Russians finally, they felt they had no other alternative but to form the Warsaw Pact. But, so the United States, like I said, we're out kidding ourselves. Oh, yeah, well, this is a defensive organization. We don't have any offensive intent. Nonsense.
One of the important points when it comes to NATO is how powerful is NATO as an army?
It's a mess. I mean, you've got, what is it, 30 countries now that are members of NATO, or well over 20. And they try to standardize training, standardize equipment, et cetera, but it's not standardized to any great extent. And, who's the biggest troop supplier in NATO? Well, the United States is number one. I believe Turkey is number two. France may be number three, but then after that, you get down into, small numbers. United Kingdom, and it's on its best day. If they took every last living, breathing member of the military and the army, it'd be 70,000. Well, that doesn't leave anybody else to, quote, defend United Kingdom then once they're signed up. Yeah, so this NATO, that's where Ukraine really, I think, occupied the position as the second or third largest army military force in NATO at the start of the special military operation. They were de facto, but they were training with NATO every year for 16 years or 14 years.
I talked with Colonel Larry Wilkerson. He pointed out that in most of these wars, in the aftermath of the Cold War, of the World War II, NATO, when NATO went to war in Iraq and Afghanistan, we didn't have any of these countries together with the United States. Most of them were out of these conflicts. They didn't experience anything on the battlefield.
Well, they don't have any experience with what's called modern warfare, fighting peer to peer. Over the years, several, they've had NATO. Some of the NATO countries have contributed troops. They did tours in Afghanistan, like the Norwegians, the Dutch, the Germans, the Spaniards, the Italians. They were in either Afghanistan or primarily Afghanistan. That was considered sort of the UN mission. So they helped serve there. But you're right, they've not had the fight and prepare to fight like Russia is. Russia has a decided advantage.
We know right now in Taiwan, a group of US Marine is in Taiwan. And do you think, are they learning something from the conflict in Ukraine to not go along with this conflict in Taiwan, or they're gonna do the same thing in Taiwan?
Oh, they'll do the same thing. They will. Yeah, no, they're gonna do the same thing. You're an optimist, dude. You keep assuming, man, people are going to learn some lessons from this stuff and they'll change their behavior. They're not like that. They haven't learned a damn thing, and they're going to continue making the mistakes. The attacking China, and I even heard, John Mearsheimer the other day, and I have a lot of respect for John, but he is obsessed with China. And he said this, what I consider the silliest damn thing about, well, the United States can't afford to let China be the dominant power in that region. And I'm saying, whoa, step back. We want the United States to be the dominant power in our region because that's where we live. What the hell right do we have to go over where the Chinese live and tell them, oh, no, you can't be in charge because we want to exercise our influence? If China tried to do that crap over here in the United States, you bet your ass we'd be upset and we'd start a war. I mean, it's crazy. And, he's a well-educated man. He's a thoughtful guy. He's soft-spoken, but that's absolutely nuts. Good Lord. Or it's like saying, how dare those Europeans think that they should have control of their territory? and exercise influence there. How dare Russia think that it should exercise influence and be the dominant power where it lives? Dude, I have no words for that. It's incredible.
There is an article in Financial Times that Antony Blinken says that China is stepping up its support for Russia. When you're trying to intimidate China in Taiwan, what China can do?
Look, this is all the fault, if you want to assign fault and blame, of Joe Biden and his inept, incompetent, feckless foreign policy team, with the likes of Jake Sullivan and Antony Blinken and for Victoria Nuland. So 52 years ago, when Richard Nixon signed a deal with the Chinese, the United States recognized that Taiwan was part of China. We didn't say, no, China's an independent state nation, independent of you, China. No, we said, China, you're right. Taiwan is part of you. Now, we still want to be able, and so we stopped putting our embassy there. We stopped recognizing it as a separate state. Now, the United States always tried to sort of skate around that a little bit. But throughout this period, one of the other key cornerstones of U.S. foreign policy was we want to keep Russia and China apart. We want to divide them. It was like that scene from Ghostbusters. You remember where Rick Moranis had turned into this one dog, and Sigourney Weaver was a Gozer or something, and if they got together, oh my God, the world was going to end. And so we've got to keep them apart. Okay, that was U.S. policy, keeping Russia and China apart. Don't get them together. If they get together, we got trouble. Well, guess what? We impose these sanctions and lead the charge in sanctioning Russia, punishing Russia. At the same time, you've got politicians from both Republican and Democrat side going into Taiwan to say to the Chinese, hey, China, yeah, up yours. And then one of the senior officers at INDOPACOM, the U.S. Military Command of the Pacific, yeah, we're going to be at war with China in 2 years. And then they're surprised that China and Russia are working together. I mean, it's like people taking a stupid pill. It's unbelievable. So the consequence of U.S. ineptitude has brought China and Russia together. And Blinken's wrong. China stepping up its support for Russia. Russia doesn't need anything from China. It certainly doesn't need manpower. It's making all the drones it can, pump out. It doesn't. One thing that Russia does that China can't do is Russia builds its own commercial aircraft. China is still relying upon, crap from the West. Hopefully they're not, maybe that's a secret U.S. war plan. Send the Chinese Boeing aircraft, then they'll blow up on their own and we'll defeat China that way. So, yeah, this is, Blinken is an idiot. There's no other way to look at it. He's a complete fool. And that's what is leading the U.S. State Department.
Do you remember they were talking about that North Korea is helping Russia, it's sending missiles to Russia? Do we have any evidence that Russians are using their missiles?
I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think it was so much missiles as it was artillery shells and ammunition on that front. But I had argued a long time ago that if North Korea wants to test certain weapon systems, what better place than to put them into theater, let the Russians test them out, see if they work in combat conditions. It's one thing to sit down on paper and say, okay, this is what it should do. We've run the math, we've run the calculations, but then put it out there in the real world and see, does it work that way or not? So this is the ultimate field test. So I wouldn't be surprised at that at all. Same with the Chinese. That if I'm Russia and the Chinese or the North Koreans approach and say, hey, we'd like to try out this just to see, is it effective? Is it not effective? Is it, what are its limitations? I'm sure the Russians say, come on down, be our guest.
Thank you for watching, like and subscribe.